Dear students, welcome to the class of Conveyancing and Legal Writings, Law 401, Section 1, Week 3, Part 1. We will start this class, Week 3, with recitals. That is the last essential part of the non-operative part. It is a Latin word means to read out. These are a narrative of what has led to the necessities or desirabilities of executing of deed or document. They contain a brief history in short form of the motive for making the deed. Recitals begin with the familiar words, whereas the parties are desirous of or have agreed on some particular course of action. Recitals usually show the reasons and history of title designed to show that the grantor is entitled to make the disposition. There must be set out in such a manner as to show a complete unbroken chain, and in such order that they are properly connected and consistent. Therefore, particularly, recitals is such part of a legal document that contains the purpose for which the deed is made. This is the format of legal document for sale contract. It is just a sample. As we already knew that there are four parts of the non-operative part. First one is description of the deed, second one date of deed, third one party's name, and last one is recitals. Therefore, you have to start with description of the deed, that is the deed of sale. Next part, date of the deed of sale made on the 5th day of September 1982. Third part is party's name. For party's name, you have to remember it is a bilateral or multilateral deed. It refers to a type of real property deed. It is a form of legal contract between two or more parties and not only concerns for one person. And in this deed, two parties agreed to continue mutual obligation. Therefore, you have to write the both parties' name. Here we mentioned A, first party, and B, second party. The last part is recitals. For recitals, you can write down in this way that the seller have accepted the said offer to the purchaser and have agreed to sell the scheduled land to the purchaser under the following terms and conditions stated herein after. The operative part of the legal instrument carries out the main objects of the instrument. That means consists of the words which carry out the principal objects or main objects of the instrument. Testatum is the first part of the operative part. After the recitals, the operative parts of the deed begin. Generally with the words, now this deed witnesses that. This part gives effect to the intention of the parties and set out in detail the transaction between the parties. It sets out the capacity in which the parties are acting and the payment and receipt of consideration. Words like grants, agrees, confirms, sells, transfer, conveys, assigns, etc. are used to denote the purpose and objects of the deed. In this part, the property which is the subject of the deed is also described. Next follows the Hebendum. This part of the deed used to be introduced by the words to have and to hold. The purpose of the Hebendum is to define the interest conveyed and to set out the limitation or terms of the property involved. For example, it shows whether the creation of a trust or absolute sale. Moreover, you should remember that Hebendum is not essential or necessary part of a deed. It can be used as a part of the testatum. Basically, the Hebendum deals with the relationship between the parties. For example, for sale deed, it will create the relationship between the possessor and the land and explain how the land is to be had. That means his immediate superior lord. Again, the provisions of the Hebendum clause must agree with those stated in the granting clause. For example, if the grantor conveys a timeshare interest or an interest less than fees, simply absolute, the Hebendum clause would specify the owner's right as well as how these rights are limited. That means a specific time frame or certain prohibited activities. Or the Hebendum clause can define how long the interest granted will extend. The term is usually so long thereafter as oil and gas is produced in paying quantities. Therefore, Hebendum shows the basic terms of the contract and details terms of the contract, and it is usually included in property related all documents. Last part of the operative part is exception, reservation and covenant. All the exception and reservation which are intended to be attached to the transfer should be clearly stated. The operation of an exception in a deed is to retain in the grantor some portion of his former estate, which by the exception is taken out of or excluded from the grant. And whatever is thus excluded remains in him as of his former right or title, because it is not granted. A reservation vests in the grantor in the deed some new rights or interest not before existing in him. Therefore, in determining whether a particular form of words constitutes an exception or a reservation, you should remember that when the effects of the words is to create in the grantor some easement as using that land as a walking way not before existing, the result is a reservation. But to constitute an exception, the easement need not have had a legal existence before the deed. It is sufficient if it exists in fact on the surface of the ground right to extract minerals even though at the time of the deed all the grounds is owned by one person. On the other hand, covenant means any terms and conditions by which the parties bind themselves. It is not necessary to mention most of the time every document must contain such covenant as the terms and conditions. But if any special terms are made at variance with the implied covenant, then that covenant must be clearly stated. For example, mortgage. There are different kinds of mortgage. If any special terms are made at variance with the kinds of mortgage, then those terms or covenants must be clearly stated.